When my sister told me the beach house was no longer mine, I didn't raise my voice or ask her how she could say something like that. I just smiled and listened while she explained it the way people explain bad news they didn't cause. And even though her words were about foreclosure and banks and paperwork, what I really heard was the sound of something old and trusted breaking quietly inside me. Because this house was not just a place I owned, it was a place I survived in, and the fact that she could stand there in my kitchen and talk about it as if it had already slipped out of my hands told me she believed the story was finished, even though I hadn't read the last page yet. I had bought the beach house 12 years earlier, back when my life felt smaller and heavier at the same time, when work filled my days and silence filled my nights. And I remember standing on the empty porch the first evening, listening to the ocean breathe in the dark, telling myself that if I could hold on to this one place, I would be okay no matter what else went wrong, because some people collect money or status, but I collected quiet, and this house gave it to me without asking questions. The mortgage was large, larger than anything I had ever taken on before, and every month when the payment left my account, I felt it, but I never missed one. Not during slow business years, not during personal losses, not even when I worked 2 jobs and slept in short pieces like a broken night, because paying that mortgage was my promise to myself that I would not let go of the one thing that felt stable in a life that often wasn't. My sister, Leela, loved the house almost as much as I did, or at least she said she did, and from the first summer I owned it, she spoke about it as if it belonged to all of us, saying things like our place and family house, and I never corrected her because it felt harmless, and because growing up we had been taught that correcting family was a kind of betrayal, so I let her words sit there without challenge, not knowing how powerful unchallenged words can become over time. Leela had always been the confident one, the one who spoke easily and moved through rooms like she expected to be welcomed, while I had learned to be quieter, more careful, listening before I spoke. And that difference followed us into adulthood, shaping how people saw us and how we saw ourselves. Because when Leela talked, people leaned in, and when I stayed silent, people assumed I agreed, even when I didn't. When her marriage began to crack in ways she didn't want to explain to anyone else, she came to the beach house often, sometimes for weekends, sometimes for weeks, and I told myself that was what family did, that you made space without keeping score. And those nights we would sit at the kitchen table with tea, the sound of the waves moving in the distance, and she would talk about feeling trapped and tired while I listened, never imagining that one day she would sit in that same kitchen explaining why the house was no longer mine. The first sign that something was wrong didn't come as a fight or a demand. It came quietly, the way most important changes do, in the form of missing mail and small comments that didn't quite fit, like when a neighbor asked if I was selling the place, or when Leela mentioned she had spoken to someone at the bank just to understand options. And I remember laughing it off at the time, telling her there were no options to consider because everything was under control, not realizing that control can be taken long before it is announced. By the time she told me the house was foreclosed, the ground had already shifted beneath me, but I didn't know it yet. And as she spoke calmly about deadlines and final notices, I watched the rain slide down the window and wondered why she seemed so certain while I felt strangely untouched by panic. And I think now that part of me already knew the truth, that something about her story didn't align with the years of careful payments and constant bank communication I had lived with. But knowing something quietly and proving it out loud are very different things. That night, I packed a small bag and left the house without argument, telling myself it was temporary, telling myself I would sort it out later, and as I locked the door, I rested my hand on the handle longer than necessary, not because I believed I was saying goodbye, but because I felt like I was stepping into a chapter I hadn't chosen, one that would test how much silence I was willing to mistake for peace. After I left the beach house, life did not fall apart the way people expect it to when something big is taken from you. Instead, it became quiet in a way that felt unnatural because the bank stopped calling, the emails stopped coming, and the reminders that had once arrived with steady precision simply disappeared. And at first, I told myself that this must be what foreclosure looks like from the other side, a clean cut, a sudden silence. But at night, when I lay awake listening to the sound of traffic instead of waves, that explanation felt thin, like a blanket that does not quite cover your feet. Days turned into weeks, and during that time, my sister's presence grew stronger while mine seemed to fade, because relatives began calling not to ask questions, but to offer comfort, saying things like how sorry they were and how lucky I was to have Leela step in. And each call followed the same pattern: gentle voices, careful words, and an unspoken agreement that the story had already been decided. And I noticed how no one asked me what had happened. They only reacted to what they had already been told, which made me realize how easily a version of events becomes reality once it is repeated with enough confidence. Leela herself called often, her tone soft and steady, checking on me in a way that sounded caring but felt strangely distant. And every time she spoke about the house, she used past tense, saying things like "when you had it" or "back when it was yours." And those small phrases pressed against my chest harder than any accusation could have, because they were said without cruelty, without emotion, as if ownership were something that naturally fades if you stop holding on to it tightly enough. One afternoon, unable to sit with the uncertainty any longer, I logged into my mortgage account online, not expecting much, just hoping for clarity. And when the screen loaded, my heart slowed instead of racing, because the account was still there, active and current, with no red warnings, no missed payments, and a next due date marked neatly in the future. And I stared at it for a long time, refreshing the page as if the truth might change if I looked away. But it stayed the same, calm and factual, telling a story very different from the one my sister had been telling everyone else. Even then, I didn't call the bank, and that hesitation surprised me, because I had always been direct with problems, but this felt different, heavier, as if making that call would turn suspicion into certainty, and I realized that part of me was still hoping I was wrong, that there was a misunderstanding that could be cleared up quietly, because once you accept that someone you trust has crossed a line, there is no easy way back to how things were before. Around that time, small details began to surface, things I might have ignored if I were less tired, like learning from a neighbor that Leela had introduced herself as the homeowner, or hearing that she had installed new locks for security, and each piece of information landed softly but stayed with me, building a shape I didn't yet want to name. And I noticed how my sister never asked if I planned to return, never spoke about next steps for me, only about how settled things were now, as if the future had already been rearranged without my input. I drove back to the beach one evening, telling myself I only wanted closure, not confrontation, and as I stood across the street looking at the house, it felt smaller than I remembered, not because it had changed, but because I was no longer inside it. And when I saw the sign by the door asking people not to enter, something in me shifted, because signs are meant to keep strangers out, and I realized I was being treated like one. When Leela arrived later and saw me standing there, she didn't look surprised, only mildly concerned, and she told me gently that it wasn't a good idea for me to be around the property anymore, explaining that banks don't like complications. And I remember nodding, not because I agreed, but because her certainty was beginning to reveal itself as performance, something practiced and repeated, and performances rely on the audience staying quiet. That night, back in a borrowed room that did not feel like home, I went over every payment I had made, every confirmation email I remembered, every routine call I used to receive, and the more I thought about it, the more the silence from the bank felt wrong, because institutions do not simply stop speaking when money is owed, and the absence of pressure began to feel louder than any demand ever had. The next few days brought more distance, more polite messages from family that carried an unspoken suggestion to move on, to let go, and I noticed how often the word acceptance came up, as if accepting something you never agreed to was a virtue. And I started to understand that this was not just about a house, it was about who gets believed when stories conflict, and how easily quiet people are written out of their own lives. The moment that truly unsettled me came when a piece of mail arrived at my temporary address, already opened, forwarded with a casual note attached, and inside was a bank statement addressed to me, showing a balance that made my breath catch, and a payment schedule that continued forward like nothing had happened. And in that moment, the confusion cleared, replaced by a steady, uncomfortable clarity, because foreclosure does not look like this, and mistakes do not line up so neatly, and I finally allowed myself to think the thought I had been avoiding, that this was not an accident, and that the rising conflict I felt was not with a system, but with someone who knew me well enough to move quietly and confidently while I stayed silent. I sat there holding that paper long after the light changed outside, feeling something new settle in alongside the sadness. Not anger, but resolve, because silence may feel safe, but it also leaves room for others to speak for you. And as I folded the statement and set it down, I understood that whatever came next would not be loud or dramatic, it would be careful and deliberate, because the truth, once you decide to face it, does not need to rush. The days after that envelope arrived were strange and heavy, because every time I tried to speak to someone about what had happened, the story had already been decided without me, and my sister had woven it so carefully that everyone around me treated her certainty as truth, while I felt like a shadow of myself, walking through my own life as if it were someone else's. And every time I tried to piece together what was real, another small detail shifted under my feet, like the new locks on the doors, the mail I never received, the phone calls redirected, and the casual way she told neighbors she was handling things while I was forced to stay quiet. I started noticing things I had overlooked before, small gestures that didn't make sense at the time, her rearranging furniture as if she lived there permanently, asking about my travel plans with a knowing smile, checking on neighbors and work contacts, pretending she was just being helpful, and each time she acted this way, I felt a tiny piece of control slip from my hands, until the feeling was almost unbearable, because it wasn't loud or violent, it was subtle, practiced, and methodical, like water slowly shaping rock without ever being noticed. One afternoon, I returned to the house just to stand on the street and look at it from a distance, and seeing it through the rain, the porch wet, the windows reflecting the gray sky, it felt smaller somehow, like it had been resized to her measure, not mine. And when she pulled up in her car a few minutes later and smiled, asking casually what I was doing there, I realized that she was performing calm, that she had rehearsed every interaction, every word, every expression, so that anyone watching would believe she belonged there, and I understood suddenly that I was invisible in a place that had once been mine. I tried to keep my balance, to not let panic or anger take over, because I had learned early that silence can be a weapon if you wield it carefully, and I started tracing back every transaction, every bank alert I had received, every signature I had made, and each time I compared it to what I knew was happening, the pattern became clear, small pieces forming a map of manipulation. She had redirected mail, taken my access points, built a story for neighbors and relatives, and even the bank's calm silence was part of the plan, because silence allows assumptions to become truth. Every night, I sat alone with my thoughts, imagining conversations I hadn't had yet, letters I would write, and phone calls I might make, and the emotional weight grew because I felt trapped in the patience of my own silence. I had been waiting for clarity, and clarity had finally arrived, but it was heavier than any anger I could have felt, because it revealed not only betrayal, but also how easily trust can be exploited when it is given without boundaries, and how quietly a person can take what they want if the other party refuses to question the story being told around them. One evening, I confronted a neighbor about a small comment they had made, and as gently as I could, I asked what they knew, and their reply made my stomach twist. "Oh, Lila said she's taking care of everything now. I didn't think you were coming back." Their certainty, spoken like it was fact, made me realize how far the story had spread, and that every assumption, every polite smile, every quiet nod I had received in the past weeks had been feeding her version of reality, while my own voice had no place in it. By then, I understood that my sister's quiet, methodical control over the narrative was complete. She had manipulated family, neighbors, and even the bank's perception of me, without anyone ever raising a voice. And in that moment, I realized that revenge, if it were ever to come, would need to be equally quiet, deliberate, and precise, because anger alone could not undo months of patient manipulation, and any hasty action could make me look foolish while she maintained her calm, practiced smile. The tension grew so thick that I could feel it in my chest constantly, like a steady pressure, and sometimes I would wake in the middle of the night imagining the house, imagining the locks, imagining the letters I never received, imagining how confidently she had rewritten a story that belonged to both of us, and I began plotting silently, not with loud confrontation, but with quiet strategy, knowing that to reclaim what was mine, I would need the law, evidence, and patience, and that every misstep could give her more power. And then came the day the bank finally called, not to her, but to me, a polite, calm voice from a vice president explaining recent communications about the mortgage, and in that one call, the tension that had been building for months broke like a wave, because it proved what I had suspected all along. My sister had lied. She had redirected my mail. She had convinced everyone around me that the house was gone, when in reality it had never left my name or my account. And in that moment, all the quiet tension of the past months exploded inside me in a way that was still silent, because anger could not convey the shock, nor could words capture the precise mixture of betrayal, disbelief, and relief that flooded me at once. I remember sitting there, staring at the rain-streaked window, the lines of the apartment walls seeming to close in, as the VP patiently explained how the mail had been forwarded to an address she had access to, how the bank had assumed I was intentionally ignoring the notices, and how every automatic process in place had been hijacked without anyone outside noticing. And for a moment I felt numb, realizing the full scope of what had been done, the patience, the planning, and the confidence with which my sister had built her quiet empire over something that was legally mine, and yet she had done it without confrontation, without a single raised voice, only a practiced calm that fooled everyone, including me, until the truth was impossible to ignore. When the VP finished, I didn't shout, I didn't cry, I only said one word: "I understand." And even in saying it, I felt a strange clarity settle over me, because this was the moment when all the pieces came together: the letters, the silence, the neighbor comments, the polite family calls, the casual confidence in Lila's voice. All of it suddenly made sense, and for the first time in months I could think clearly, because the truth had arrived calmly, like a tide that pushes back against the shore after a long storm. That night I returned to the beach house not to confront anyone, but to stand on the porch and feel it again, and everything seemed different, heavier and yet mine, because the realization of what had been taken and what had been preserved created a strange mixture of emotions: relief that the house was legally still mine, grief that someone I loved had used silence and trust to manipulate me, and anticipation, quiet and controlled, because I now knew that the only way forward would be deliberate, precise, and measured, and that any hasty reaction could undo months of careful patience I had maintained to protect myself. I thought about every conversation with Leela, every gentle, helpful gesture, every neighbor or family member who had assumed her version of events, and I understood how skillfully she had orchestrated the narrative.
But now the truth was concrete, undeniable, and verifiable, and for the first time the possibility of reclaiming the house fully, without drama, without noise, without anyone believing her version over facts, became real. And I realized that the turning point had arrived not with shouting, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with the quiet confirmation of fact, the kind of slow, patient revelation that makes betrayal visible while leaving space for a careful, intelligent response. By the end of that day, I had made my decisions in my mind. The house would be reclaimed, all legal and financial channels restored, but I would not allow the past silence to be repeated. I would not hand over trust without verification again, and I would approach every step with the same calm, deliberate patience that my sister had used against me, because now I knew the power of quiet control, and I intended to match it, not with rage, but with clarity. And in that moment, standing in the pouring rain on the porch of my own house, I realized that this turning point was not only about the mortgage or the house, it was about understanding the nature of trust, betrayal, and the quiet power that comes from knowing the truth and waiting for the right time to act. After the call with the bank, the weight that had been pressing on my chest for months didn't instantly vanish, but instead shifted into a steady, controlled focus, because now I knew exactly what had happened, and with that clarity came a strange combination of relief and sadness, knowing that the house, the place I had poured years of my life into, was still legally mine, yet realizing fully that someone I had trusted had quietly tried to rewrite my story for everyone around me. And as I walked through the rooms again, every creak in the floorboards, every fading paint line, every salty breeze that came through the open windows felt both familiar and foreign, as if the house itself had been holding its breath, waiting for truth to arrive. I spent hours reviewing every letter, every statement, every email, making sure all the accounts were correct, all the mail was redirected to me, and all access points that had been quietly taken were restored. And during this process, I understood that quiet patience had been my only ally, because had I acted hastily in the past months, without the full picture, I could have lost not only the house, but the chance to reclaim control calmly and intelligently. And this lesson settled into me slowly, like the tide washing smooth stones on the shore. When I finally confronted Leela, it wasn't dramatic or loud. I didn't yell, I didn't accuse, I didn't demand apologies, because I realized that confrontation without understanding would only give her room to perform again. And so I sat across from her at the old kitchen table, the same one where months ago she had explained my loss, and I simply said, "I know what happened, and it's all sorted now." And I watched her eyes widen slightly, caught off guard, not by anger, not by rage, but by calm certainty, because she realized finally that her manipulation had been revealed, quietly, clearly, with facts, and there was no space left for her performance. The neighbors, the family, everyone who had accepted her story in good faith began noticing changes too, subtle at first, letters arriving in my name, casual mentions from the bank, polite corrections when she tried to say the house was gone, and I noticed that the air around me shifted as people began to see reality for what it was. And even though I said little, letting evidence and consistency speak for themselves, the quiet reclamation of the house felt more satisfying than any dramatic confrontation could have been, because it was done with precision, patience, and without unnecessary conflict. And that calm, deliberate approach became a form of quiet revenge, one that did not humiliate or punish, but restored what was mine without chaos. In the weeks that followed, I settled back into the house, taking time to restore not just the physical space, but the emotional connection I had lost, walking the shoreline at dawn, listening to the waves, letting the wind clear the residual weight of betrayal, and gradually I began to forgive, not for her sake, but for mine, understanding that holding on to bitterness would only make the walls feel smaller, the nights longer, and that reclaiming my peace was as important as reclaiming my property. I also started to rebuild boundaries, carefully observing who I trusted, documenting communications, keeping records, and learning the quiet power of vigilance, because the lesson was clear. Kindness and silence can be mistaken for weakness, trust can be manipulated, and those who act with patience and calm can shape reality. But knowing the truth and holding it firmly allows you to reclaim control without drama, without shouting, without loss of dignity. And in that, I found a strange satisfaction, a quiet victory that felt far stronger than any loud revenge could ever have been.
By the end of that season, the house felt like mine again, fully mine, not just in legal terms, but emotionally, because I had navigated betrayal, I had learned to observe patiently, and I had reclaimed my story without losing my calm or my integrity. And every evening when I sat on the porch, watching the ocean reflect the fading light, I felt a quiet strength in knowing that the power of patience and truth is more lasting than the cleverness and deceit, and that even after betrayal, life can return to a peaceful rhythm if you let it, if you hold on to clarity, and if you move with deliberate care. Today, when I sit on the porch of the beach house, listening to the waves roll in quietly and watching the horizon stretch wide and endless, I feel a calm I didn't have months ago, a clarity that comes from surviving betrayal and quietly reclaiming what was mine. And I think about Leela, about how someone you love and trust can manipulate silence and patience to shape reality, and I no longer feel anger so much as understanding, because the lesson wasn't in punishing her or proving her wrong, it was in seeing clearly, holding on to facts, and allowing patience to guide my actions instead of impulse. And in that, I learned that the strongest power we have is not loud confrontation or dramatic revenge, but the quiet certainty of truth and deliberate calm. I reflect on every late night, every letter, every redirected mail, every gentle smile that masked deceit, and I realize now that life often tests us in ways we cannot anticipate, and the way we respond, whether with patience, observation, and measured action, or with rashness and anger, shapes not only the outcome but also the strength we carry afterward. And in facing Leela's quiet betrayal, I discovered that silence can be dangerous, but it can also be protective if wielded with awareness, and that truth has a way of revealing itself in time if we remain steady and patient. The house feels different now, not just because the locks are mine again or the mail is correctly addressed, but because I have returned to it fully, emotionally and mentally. And in walking through the rooms, hearing the waves from the porch and letting the wind sweep through the curtains, I understand that home is more than property. It is the space where trust, patience, and clarity intersect, and that reclaiming it is not about victory over someone else, but about reclaiming yourself, your peace, and the quiet rhythm of your own life. I've learned to forgive, not because she deserved it, but because holding on to bitterness would only shrink my world, and I've learned that observation, patience, and calm reflection are stronger than any loud argument, any dramatic exposure, because the quiet reclamation of what is rightfully yours leaves no doubt, no damage to your own character, and no room for manipulation to take hold again. And in that, there is a satisfaction deeper than anger, more lasting than revenge, and more peaceful than closure achieved through conflict. And so, every evening, when the sun dips low and the horizon turns soft pink and gold, I sit quietly with my coffee, listening to the ocean, reflecting on what happened, and I remind myself that life will test trust, patience, and silence, that betrayal can be subtle and deliberate, but the truth, if held carefully, will always have a way of returning, and that the quiet strength to act calmly, deliberately, and with clarity is the most powerful way to reclaim not just what is yours, but who you are. And that realization, more than any payment or property, is the true victory I carry with me now.